Welcome back. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It really does help when people are doing searches for my videos. This video today is going to be a fairly in-depth video on regearing a traditional Dana 44 differential. When I say traditional Dana 44, what I am referring to is the pinion gear. Now, in the traditional Dana 44, the pinion gear has shims to attain the bearing preload instead of a crush lead, which is what the later model units use. This particular traditional Dana 44 has been used since, well, probably about 90 years now. There's a lot of them out there. So this particular style of differential is probably one of the most popular Dana differentials ever built. It's also been copied by a lot of other manufacturers. So with that, time to get it. We're doing a regear and a locker upgrade on a Dana 44 in a Jeep TJ, early 2000s. This is a very typical Dana 44. I've got the axles pulled out, 8-10 inches. That way the differential can drop out. I've got the drive shaft disconnected. Obviously I've got the cover off and it's drained. I've also sprayed it a little bit. Now, this differential has markings. This one's kind of easy to see. This one I'm not real positive. So again, always mark your caps and your bearing position and location. And if you haven't watched any of my other videos, the reason you do that is because these are line bored, and if you flip those bearings, your bearings are not lined up correctly. It'll create a problem with your bearing wear, obviously, but it can also create a problem with your gear pattern. So now that I've got these marked, I'm going to go ahead and pull the caps off. Now you can take these cap bolts off with an impact. I like knocking them loose by hand and then using an impact afterwards, especially on the smaller ones, just in case there's a problem. If one of these bolts is really loose, it'll give you a heads up for something to look for. Yeah, that one's a little tight. Yeah, this may have been empty before. Feels a little tighter than falling out. So. Just gonna leave one of the bearing caps up here. I'm gonna see if this will walk out. If it walks out, then I won't put the case spreader on. To see if they walk out, just put a wrench on the bottom, one up higher. And this one will walk out. So. I'm not going to put a case spreader on this yet. I will probably put the case spreader on when I get ready for reassembly. That way I can stretch a little bit and get a little better preload. If I don't need small shims, I can tap this back in with large shims, and then I won't use a case spreader. It just depends on how it goes back together. But you definitely want some preload on your bearings. All right, and I'm happy to see this has shims on the outside of the carrier. That means I don't have to use setup bearings to put shims behind the bearing. To me, these are easier to set up your backlash. Now for initial setup, I'm going to keep these separated left and right until I get a chance to measure them. Once I measure them, and if I determine they're the same thickness, then it won't matter if I mix them up. If one's thicker than the other, that's the orientation I will put them in initially. On the pinion, usually you can hold on to it by hand, but I'm trying to abuse myself less when I'm doing this stuff. Okay, now that we've got the yolk off, sometimes you have to tap the yolk, sometimes you have to use a pour. This one looks like it's had a little bit of leakage, but once I have it off, ooh, every now and then you get lucky. It just dropped. Usually I'll put this nut on and then I can put a ball peen hammer or a tap on the back of it. Okay, another thing I'd like you to notice here, this does not have a crush sleeve. This has shims. This is what I prefer. Hopefully the new one will too. But this is what sets the preload on the bearings. The depth will be set by either a shim behind the pinion, and you notice this one does not have a slinger. It sits down low enough in the oil that it really doesn't need one. But behind the inner race, which we'll get to here shortly, that's where the shims for this probably are, to allow it to go pinion deep, pinion shallow, or as I always say, pinion closer to or further away from the differential ring gear. There's lots of methods for getting pinion seals out. I usually just use a big pry bar. Sometimes they don't work. Wow, that one's in tight. So that didn't work. What I'll do is I'll knock it with a chisel here and then pry it out. Here we go. Once you get the seal out, your outer bearing comes out and your upper oil. This is not a slinger, this is actually more of a retainer. It just slows down the oil from getting back to the bottom of the differential as quick. If you leave the oil up a little longer, better lubrication. While I'm on this side, I'm going to grab a punch and I'm going to knock out the inner race, then go around to the other side and knock out the outer race. One of my specialty tools, a long punch. And it'll come out and go across the floor. And the outer race the same way. A little deeper in this one. Now the differential is totally stripped. I'll do a little more clean out, get the oil out of it. And then it's ready for reassembly. Now on this particular one, there is one more thing I will do, but I'm not going to do that until I see where my ring gear is in here. But I have to drill a hole in this housing somewhere at the top, probably right there. It looks like a really good spot. It's kind of a flat area. Anyway, for the wiring to go through for the electric locker. Something else I would always recommend doing, there are pathways up in the front of the housing. You can get your fingers in them, you can get rags in them, and you can clean them. But if you ever had a catastrophic failure, broken teeth, bearing, something like that, you really want to get in those and make sure you get everything cleaned out of there too. Talk about what we're putting together here getting our parts organized first. First thing, I'm using Revolution gears. This is becoming my favorite gear out there anymore, and the reason being, they are 5-cut gears. These set up really smooth. I've been really happy with them. Hopefully they don't change anything. Every time some of these companies try to do something a little cheaper, a little more cost effective, they seem not to set up as well. But so far, this is probably the 6th or 8th set of their gears I've set up. We'll see how this one comes out, but so far they've all set up really nice and fairly easy. Most of them you can set up by the numbers. Now, like I said, when we pulled this one apart, it came with side gear shims, pinion shims, new bolts, nut, and it comes with the shims for the pinion. This is a non-crush sleeve style. This is a spacer type if you were going to do a crush sleeve eliminator, or most of the original Dana 44s, Dana 30s, that type of thing, they were all originally set up for shimmed to space your preload. So this is going to be a little different than like the Dana 30 I did with this same Eaton locker. And that's the other thing we are converting this to, is an Eaton locker instead of the open carrier. That was one of the primary reasons he wanted me to do this regear. Remember, 456 and higher number, lower ratio means they need to be a thicker gear if you're using the same carrier that would work for a 410 and down, or 410 and higher ratio. Things in differentials are always backwards, aren't they? This particular carrier will take multiple different ring gears, so it has different bolt hole sizes. Make sure you use the right size bolt hole for the ring gear that is in your kit. You don't want them to slop around. This is a fairly easy bench setup now. I don't have to put a slinger in here. I don't have to put any kind of a spacer because there's not one in the old one. So I'm just going to press the new bearing onto the pinion. I'm going to just bolt the ring gear on. And this particular 44 is big enough around that it goes over the electromagnetic clutch. I don't have to worry about pulling that magnetic clutch off to get the ring gear. I am not using the new nut until I am doing final assembly again on this. Okay, I got everything unpackaged, and to my surprise, I was very excited, and it was nice to see these are lock bolts. However, it did come with Loctite, so I will use Loctite on top of the lock bolt. If these come loose, you really did something wrong. Now, again, this is the inner pinion bearing. These are the shims that go behind that pinion bearing. I'll double check the housing, make sure there were no shims in it. And then our first contact pattern for pinion depth will be based on whatever it had in there, and then we will adjust more or less from there. On the side gear races, remember, there's no shims behind the bearing on the carrier side. All the shims go to the outside. So this is a fairly easy setup process. I don't have to use my clamshell puller to pull off any old bearings. I'm not going to pull any of those bearings off of that ring and pinion. I'm going to package them up. Maybe they'll use them for something else. First thing I'm going to do is clean the ring gear and start bolting some stuff together. All right, I always line up the bolts from underneath. That way I don't have to hold the ring gear up. Once I get a couple of them started, I'll flip it over and do the rest of them. Now this is a very low impact. I don't recommend using this as your torque method. All I'm doing is drawing the ring gear up and snugging the bolts down. The torque spec on these is 55 pounds. My chain wrench will hold most of the load. And then as I go around, I mark them. That way I don't mix up anything. Now that I've gone around, everything's marked. I want to recheck a few of them, just in case. Initially, when I pulled this out, it did not look like there was a shim between the bearing and the head. However, once I got it in better light and cleaned up, there is a shim in there. So I am going to pull this apart with the clamshell puller, and I will transfer that spacer shim to the new pinion for the start of my setup. Setting up the clamshell, make sure you put the race back on it, or even use a new race. You want to make sure your thumb wheels are between the race and the upper lip of your clamshell. There you go. Best part about this particular puller is the bearing comes off clean and the shim comes off clean. Now that I've got this shim out, there's a couple things you kind of want to decide. This is a fairly thick shim. Now, I double checked the housing and there are no shims behind that inner bearing. So this was the only shim that was accommodating for the pinion depth. All right, I'm gonna take a couple minutes and talk about the first critical measurement on setting up a differential, and that is pinion depth. If that contact pattern, which indicates your pinion depth being shallow, deep, ring too close, ring too far away, however you want to call it, it is your first critical measurement. If that measurement isn't correct, it really doesn't matter if your preload's off, it really doesn't matter if your backlash is off. The gears aren't going to wear properly, and they're probably going to be noisy on top of it. So, initially, this pinion came with a shim which went behind the inner bearing, between that and the head of the pinion gear. The kit came with shims that go behind the race. Now, it doesn't matter which ones you want to use to get your final depth. I always recommend using the original shim thickness, or the original shim for that matter, as a starting point. That way you know if you can go less or more pinion depth to gain the correct contact pattern. So what I kind of prefer doing, if I have enough shims that will go behind this bearing, I like using a burr and reaming out the bearing. That way I can slide it on and off by hand. I don't have to hammer the race in and out multiple times that way. Once I get the pinion thickness of shims I need to attain my contact pattern, I will either leave these behind the new bearing and press it on, or I will convert it to the correct thickness of shims that go behind the race. Now, sometimes if I have this shim behind the pinion head in that bearing and I actually have to add some more thickness, I'll just leave that shim behind a new bearing and then I'll add the difference between this. It really doesn't matter if you go to total thickness on the shims behind the race or total thickness of the shims behind the head of the bearing, or a combination of both. But whichever you do, you want to get the depth correct first. That'll really determine the quality of your setup from there on out. When they start talking about pinion depth, my ring gear is here. This needs to go this way, not this way. So I need to remove a shim from this head. So now what I'm thinking, here it is I can measure this shim and I can make the shims that go behind that inner race 1/1000th less than this, and I should be able to set my pinion depth in one shot. Does this always work? Not so much. It does a lot of times though, so if you want to do the math, you might save yourself some time. Got my shim loader in here. I have a feeling I might have to remove it, but I want to see first. Make sure there's no daylight. Make sure there's some resistance on your press. You don't want that to not be fully pressed. Okay, this looks like I need to run a collar. There we go. I can see just a little bit of daylight under that bearing. So I put on another race that I have that's a little bit bigger than the shaft of the carrier, so that it'll allow that bearing to slide on that last little bit of 1/1000th of an inch. Yep. I know it is going to need this as well. Installing these races, you usually get them started with a hammer without a punch. Once you kind of get them started, you'll have to use a punch. I'm getting close to getting it seated. Once it seats, you'll hear that tone change when you're tapping on it. There. It's seated, and then you want to visually look at it too. I'm just going to go to the other side and get the inner one in. The inner one is really the reason you need the longer punch, so you can get a little closer to it, get it started. If one side's higher as you're starting to go in, it'll bind up. If you hit the high side, it'll usually straighten out and let you tap it the rest of the way in. If you notice your punch start sliding off the edges, it may have a rounded corner. You may have to redress it, flatten it out a little bit. Mine was getting that way, so flattened her back out. Now you can use like aluminum seal installers for these or bearing race installers. I don't like using those on differential races because you have to hit them too hard and you usually just destroy the aluminum. If you use seal installer or a bearing installer or race installer, get the steel ones if you're going to use them. There's my tone change right there. All right, some of these are really tight, some of these aren't, but I've got some grease on the bearing, both inner and outer on the rollers, and I put a little bit on the shaft. Now I don't have any shims in here at this point. I've got, I don't need this upper slinger, but I think sometimes you will have to tap this. 4 or 5 threads showing. And then I'm going to start this with an impact. I'm going to back it out and then I'll put the washer in. Right, I tightened the yoke up just enough so I could take the nut off and put the washer back in. Now I'm using the old nut. I do not have any preload shims in here. What I'm doing right now is I want to tighten this down to take up all the slop, and I want to have some turning resistance on the bearings. Snugged up. Now it's probably 40 or so inch-pounds. I'm not going to really even test that, but what I am going to do is I'm going to make it a little bit tighter. The reason I want it a little bit tighter is that way I don't have to hold resistance to check my pinion depth pattern. I measured the original shims. I've got a 40 on the gear side and I've got a 30 on the clutch side. Now I want to be able to put this in and out and not have to force it, and I know this is going to be way too tight for me to push in and pull out to just check pinion depth. Get my shims lined up. Now I'm using 2 shims on this locker side. Putting this in, but make sure you're started, make sure it's smooth. You don't want to strip a housing out. Generally, you don't use an impact to put caps on. Again, this is just like 35 pounds or so. I'm just drawing this in, but I'm checking it, making sure I have free play. You don't want to bind the gears. Okay, I think we're tight. We have a hair of backlash, not enough to count as backlash. So I would definitely want to move one of my shims. You can do a pinion depth check right now, but if you have no backlash, it's really not going to give you a clean pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and pull these out, and I'm going to move the shim. So I've got a 40 and 20. If I swap these, I'm gonna have too much. So I'm gonna go over to the bench and I'm going to make this, I'm gonna grab that 30 that came out of the other side and I'm gonna add a 10 to this side. And now I'm gonna put the 30 on this side and add 10 thousandths to this side. That'll move the ring gear this way 10 thousandths. That'll give me some slop and it will be a little bit better to get a cleaner pattern for my Now they do actually make a tool that has a crescent shape on it for tapping shims in. If you use a real blunt head, like this is an old shim, works great. So I really don't worry much about that. Got some decent free play there. Now remember, I set that pinion pretty tight so I don't have to hold resistance. I have resistance in this. Now I'm going to go get some paint and mark this and let's see what our initial contact pattern looks like. Nice clean paint on a few teeth. You want to kind of look and see where it's getting ready to go into the pinion. And then you can run it back and forth 4 or 5 times. If you look right here, you can see that is a very harsh line at the top, and then it goes down in an arc to the root. This tells me that my pinion is too far away from my ring gear. Now I'm probably gonna go 5 thousandths based on, this is a pretty harsh line. I can go quite a ways closer to the ring gear. So I'm going to pull this back apart, pull the pinion out, add a shim behind that race, inner race, and then we'll do this again. I decided to do some exampling here. I put 10 thousandths behind that shim back there, or behind that race, and you can see now the pattern has the harsh line at the bottom and comes conical towards the top. So what I said, 5 thousandths would probably be on the money, is probably accurate. But since I'm doing this for a video, I really wanted to show what too close to the pinion was, which is what this is. Now that real quick may seem obvious, but when you're putting shim packs in after you've been handling them, make sure they're clean. There's no anything in between them because that will affect your depth. So double check, make sure they're clean before you hammer those in. Just want to double check it with a different punch. We are seated. It's really hard to see in these. The straight line you see is actually the tooth next to it. But what I'm really looking at is I'm centered here on the heel, here on the toe, and where the tooth starts making contact, it's nice and round and smooth. It doesn't have a harsh line up or down coming in or out of the tooth. And you can see I'm smooth in and smooth out on the coast side. I've got area above and below. It doesn't have a harsh angle going in or out of the tooth, so this is an acceptable pattern. And that's at 5 thousandths additional shim. Now I'm gonna set the preload on the bearings. I'm gonna start with the same thickness of shims I had. going to insert the bearing, the washer, the yoke, everything with the U stuff, just like I've been doing, except now I want to tighten it all the way up and see if it's tight, loose, where I'm at. And that'll tell me where I need to go with more shims or less shims in that preload shim pack. Make sure you get a couple turns on that so that you don't end up stripping anything out. You don't really have to worry about torquing this. You just want to make sure it is tightened up all the way. If it's tightened up all the way, bottomed out, which I am, now I can turn this really smooth, but it feels like it's a little bit tight. So what I'm going to do is I'll get the inch-pound wrench out, I'll check it. Then what I will probably have to do is take this off, and I will have to add 1 or 2 thousandths. I'm between 45 and 50 inch-pounds, so absolutely I do need to remove this. I need to add a couple of thousandths to that shim pack, and then we'll put this back in and see where I'm at again. Just an FYI, I've shown a couple techniques where you can put the nut on, hammer it, or you can run your ball peen into the pinion and then hammer it. This one fits pretty darn tight, and if you hammer on something enough, eventually you're going to miss. So on this particular one, I decided to go ahead and break down and get the 2-jaw puller out. And this is the safest way to pull off a yoke. I'm going to kind of do this like I did on the pinion depth. I added a 10,000 shim because that's the thinnest one they have, and I didn't want to go through and just measure these and figure out the combination, because I think I only need about 5 thousandths. But if I go 10 thousandths and it's too loose, that's good for a video to show someone how it shouldn't be on the other end of the spectrum, not tight but too loose. So throw this back together on the 10 thousandth and we'll see where it's at. Probably kick myself because we'll probably be on the money or something silly like that. So this is exactly what I was trying to demonstrate, that there's really no preload on the bearings. It is tight, snug down, there's no play, but I can spin this round and round. You need a little bit of preload on that. So that 10 thousandths I put in was incorrect, as I suspected. It needs to be 5. So now what I'm going to do is I'll pull this apart. I'm going to measure all of the shims and see which combination I can put together that will be 5 thousandths less than what it currently is. Set with a new stack of shims. Now basically what I did is I needed to go down 5 thousandths, so I measured all the shims and kind of set them in order of which shim was bigger to smaller, and then I checked what shims I had left, and what I ended up doing is swapping a 25 thousandths shim out of here for a 20 thousandths that was left in my stack. That dropped me down to 5 thousandths. I should be within spec on the preload now. So back together, and the test her again before final. Okay. Inch-pound wrench, I've got right at 12. I'm happy with that. I'm going to bring it around here so you can kind of see what the inch-pound wrench does. So I want rotating resistance is what I'm looking for. You can see, if you can see those little tiny numbers, that I'm somewhere between 12 and 15 inch-pounds, so I'm right on spec. All right, I don't have to remove the pinion again. I just removed the yoke. Made sure I got my washer still in there, my outer bearing still in there. I have not taken the pinion back out now that I know my preload is set. Next thing I need to do is put the yoke seal in. Now it's in, that tone changes. Now there is already grease on the inside of the seal, so I don't need to put more in there. Now, tap this back on. You only need it on so, again, you can get a few threads. Now, the new nut came flanged, so it does not have a washer and nut, it's just a single nut. Something I do, and this one, since it obviously was leaking, does not hurt to put a dab of silicone on that flange area of the nut. That'll go around, it'll squish into the surface area and may prevent a leak. All right, got my cool tool hooked up. It's easier to hold on to than channel locks. I'll finish snugging this down and then we can get the torque wrench out. Okay, this is as tight as it will go with the impact. Now, the torque spec on these is like 240 pound-feet. I like doing that instead of just hammering it down with an impact, because those torque specs are there for a reason, and generally it's to keep bolts and nuts from coming loose. So one nice part about this tool I got from 4Link Off-Road, I can put a pipe on it and extend it out here to this control arm, and then I can hang on the torque wrench on the other side. Torquing these pinions this way is a little bit easier than trying to hold everything with two hands. And there you go. So you can use this tool for crush sleeves or torquing the pinion. It is really a nice handy tool. I recommend using sacrificial bolts. Don't use the ones that hold your straps or that you may damage, because if I damage these, I can throw them away and I don't have to worry about those straps. I don't recommend checking your inch-pound with this on, because the weight of this will influence. If you can do it from straight up, maybe, but otherwise I take this off to verify my inch-pound reading, which is what I'm going to do now. I'm a little sticky with that seal in there. I'm going to throw a little oil on it and then I'll double check it. All right, I've got the shims tight enough that I don't think I'll have to use a case spreader. And pretty much all my shims are pretty thin. There's two thinner ones on this right side right now, which I may or may not leave on this right side, because my next step in this is to verify what my exact backlash is and determine if I need to move the ring gear closer or further from the pinion. Then I'll decide where I need to move shims. I'm also going to run another contact pattern to make sure I didn't have an error in getting a race seated or something like that. On final assembly, I try to kind of revisit all my races and seals before. Let's in here and see where I'm at. Actually feels pretty good. I'm gonna see if I can tap these. They're in. I think I'm close enough on my backlash. I'm going to run another pattern real quick just to be on the safe side. If something changed, something moved, it's much faster to take it apart now than it will be after it blows up, and then you have someone that's real unhappy with you on top of it. Now I'm going to put some resistance back here too. All right, my pattern hasn't changed, so I'm okay with that. Now I'm going to get the dial indicator and see where I'm at on my backlash. All right, got my dial indicator set up. The spec on this is 6 to 10 thousandths. And honestly, I'm just under 6 thousandths, so I am going to move a couple of these shims. I would rather have this a little looser than 6, closer to the 10, than I would having it 5.5. And I may even be able to move this just by changing one shim to increase my preload a little bit, be able to loosen that up. Okay, I have increased this right side to a single shim that was 5 thousandths thicker than the shim I've been pulling in and out. Basically, this is almost identical to the shim set I pulled out. So I'm gonna just tap these in. A skosh. I'll tighten them up and then see where I am for backlash, but this will give me plenty of preload too. I want to run this around, make sure it's smooth. If there's any hard spot at all, you want to double check your run out, and you can do that by putting a dial indicator over here to your ring gear and making sure that you're smooth. And I think we're good on the smooth stuff here. I've got some really good ghost patterns showing up. But I'm going to do a final pattern check. And a final backlash. I think I'll do the backlash first, because if I need to change that, that might change the pattern, just not necessarily the depth, but it'll change where it lands. Oh, I like this. So sometimes when you're changing your backlash and you think you need to add a little bit of preload, you can add just a little bit to one side, and that will squeeze those bearings a little bit, but it also splits the difference. So I had just under 6 thousandths, and now I've got 8 thousandths. I'll show you this.
All right, so let me get over where I can do this without. I'm at 0 here, and I'm at 8 thousandths. So you can just feel it click. So I am thrilled with the backlash.
All right, now I'm going to run that nice new painted pattern through the ring gear a few times and just see what it looks like. It shouldn't have changed. It might have cleaned up a little bit because my backlash is set a little cleaner. Getting some really nice ghost patterns, which sometimes it's easier to read a ghost pattern than it is the painted pattern.
All right, here's my pattern. I've got a nice round in, a nice round out. Now, it doesn't have to be centered this way. Just keep that in mind. It's not cut into the base, and it's not triangulated up into the top. And then coming down here, same thing. We've got nice round coming in and out. We've got a little bit of tooth at the top, a little bit of tooth at the bottom. I think this one's a good and go. Now all I'm going to do is torque the bearing caps.
Torque stuck on these is 60 pounds. All right, now I'll just feed my electric. I drilled this hole off video because I just don't need it for how to set up gears.
I just wanted to make a quick little side note here. This is not the painted pattern that I painted. This is what's called a ghost pattern. And if you run your differential gears around a few times, you'll get this ghost pattern on your teeth. Sometimes it is an easier pattern to read than the painted pattern that you put on. And if you look at this one right here, it's hard to do this with the flashlight and the camera. I mean, it's almost a picture-perfect pattern. So don't be afraid to look at that ghost pattern. Sometimes it's a better indication than the original painted pattern.
Okay, this one is ready to go. All I got to do is button up the cover, axles, drive shaft, the stuff that you don't need on a video. I do want to throw a couple review items in here. Double check your work. Make sure you didn't forget something. I have zipped these down with my little 35-inch or 35 foot-pound impact and then forgot to torque them, had to take the cover back off. It happens. So if you review it, there's less chance that you'll make an error. Something else I would like to a relatable story that may kind of get you a little less apprehensive about pinion depth. If you follow a lot of these forums, you will find out that, like the pattern I just showed, there's a critic everywhere that'll say you need to move it 1,000th in or 3 thousandths out. It's not perfect. Acceptable is acceptable. And kind of the way I figured out of relating acceptable pattern is an acceptable pattern is if you compare it to a first baseman playing baseball, batter hits the ball, shortstop gets it, throws it here, foot's on the bag, runner's out. Same scenario, but the first baseman catches it here, foot's on the bag, runner's out. Those are both acceptable outcomes for what just happened. If that first baseman has to jump up in the air to catch the ball, he still catches the ball, his foot's off the bag, the runner's now safe. That is not an acceptable outcome. So don't get too hung up if you are not perfect within an acceptable pattern. An acceptable pattern will wear correctly, it won't make noise, you'll get a lot of years of use out of it. So don't get too hung up on someone being overly critical. If your pattern does not have nice smooth entrance and nice smooth exits, it's got a harsh corner or a harsh line coming in, either into the root or into the crown of the tooth, definitely change it. I've showed you a couple of examples on that. So that all being said, I'm going to finish buttoning this up. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have questions on differentials, feel free to throw it in the comments. I try to answer everything I can, and there's no bad question when it comes to how to learn something. So appreciate it, and thanks again.